Alrighty, welcome back, folks. Tzaddikim and Hasidim all. Hope you're doing well, as always. And in this episode of the study, we're going to be talking about the scribes and Pharisees who are sitting in Moses' seat. Why is it his seat, and why are they sitting there? So we'll be answering some of these questions and more in this particular episode. So without further ado, how about we just jump in and start looking at some texts? So, first, we're going to be looking at some both biblical and New Testamental texts to see and essentially to give us some background information about this idea of Moses sitting. I know it's a very deep concept, isn't it? But as we'll find, it is actually a lot deeper than what most people realize. So, let's begin. According to the biblical record, Moses, quote, sat to judge the people rather than stood, for example. Rather than doing cartwheels, rather than doing handstands, Moses sat to judge the people, and he did not stand to judge the people. He just couldn't stand it. The office or the concept of there being a quote unquote seat of Moses actually harkens back to this practice where Moses would sit. He wasn't doing cartwheels, he wasn't standing, he wasn't doing anything else, but he was sitting. So in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 14, it says, "And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood by Moses from the morning until the evening. And when Moses' father-in-law, that's Jethro, or Yisro, saw that all that he did to the people, and he said, What is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning until evening?" So we find even this biblical passage is going back all the way to the book of Exodus. We find that Moses is sitting to judge the people. And what do we find the people doing? Standing. They're the ones being judged. Now, I'd like to give some special attention to particularly what is Moses doing, right? When he wants to judge the people, meaning when he wants to arbitrate all of their squabbles, all of their questions about the Torah, when he wants to give them a judgment, right? He's not out there just judging people. Like, dang, have you seen Moses lately? Just judging everybody. He's such a judgmental guy. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about him acting as a judge and giving rulings for the people, right? He's bringing peace to civilization. He's arbitrating conflicts. He's bringing peace between neighbors and spouses and friends, coworkers, everybody. And so he sits to judge the people. And really, it's to judge the people's cases that they bring to him. Now, curiously, moving on to the New Testament here, in the synagogue, the Torah is read standing up, and teaching is done sitting down. And this is how it's still done to this day. Now, sometimes people will also stand to teach just because it's more convenient, but that's more of a modern thing. Throughout all of history, whenever the Torah itself is read, the written Torah, whenever that is read, it is always done standing up. In fact, if you've ever gone to a traditional Orthodox service, you'll find this. It's very, very obvious. We make a big deal out of it. There's a whole ceremony bringing the Torah out, standing to read it, taking it to the bima, and then reading it there for everybody to see. And curiously, this is exactly what we find in the Gospels themselves. We find evidence for this custom going all the way back to that time, 2,000 years ago. And wouldn't you believe it, we're doing the same thing nowadays. It's almost like there has been continuity, right? And as we'll see, this was actually the practice of Jesus himself too. As it says in Luke 4:16, as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Right? He didn't just stand up to volunteer. He didn't stand up to go to the restroom. He stood up to read the Torah. So then a little bit later on in the same passage, actually just a few verses later, it says, then he closed the book. Now, granted, this is kind of a poor translation. He rolled the scroll back up, right? Because they didn't have codices back then. And in ritual contexts, Jews don't use codices. They use books. They use scrolls. We use scrolls. And so when he closed the book, he rolled the scroll back up, as Jews do today. And he gave it again to the minister, which is probably a reference to the Hebrew term gabai, I'm guessing. But he rolled up the scroll, gave it to the servant, and sat down. And the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened onto him. He began to say unto them, "This day is the scripture fulfilled in your ears." All right. Now, let's notice what Jesus is doing here. He stands up to read the scroll of Isaiah, but then, when he's finished reading, he rolls up the scroll, sits down, and then begins to speak his own words. He begins teaching the crowd while he sits. Notice this. Moses did the same thing. You stand to read the Torah, then you sit to judge or to teach, right? And this is why the crowd waits expectantly for him. It says, the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. They were waiting expectantly. Why? Because they implicitly understood, as was everybody's custom, not just Jesus' custom, but everybody's custom, that after a person stands to read, he sits to teach. They were expecting a teaching. This was also the typical practice of Jesus himself, right? He reads Isaiah, then sits down to interpret Isaiah. He stands to read, he sits to teach. He does not read scripture while sitting, right? And Jesus acts similarly elsewhere. In John 8:2, it says, "And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them." Right? You stand to read, you sit to teach. And in Matthew 5, verses 1 through 2, it says, "And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them." You stand to read, sit to teach. Now, let's look at some early Nazarene Ebionite evidence that supports this very idea that I'm trying to present in this episode. This standing reading, sitting teaching paradigm also seems to be the interpretation held by the earliest Jewish believers in Jesus, which were called Nazarenes here and then Ebionites there. In truth, these were really the same group, at least within Jerusalem anyway. Outside of Jerusalem, it gets a little dicey, but we know that in Jerusalem, which served as the headquarters for the early Jesus movement, that these were the same people. Now, according to one of their ancient writings called the Clementine Homilies, a text believed to have appeared around the 300s, not totally sure, but it was around the 300s that it was published anyway. It could have been written earlier, but it was around then. So in this text, it says that Peter is reported to have said near the end of his life, "Since, therefore, it is necessary to set apart someone instead of me to fill my place," right? To fill my place, to take up my office, to fill my shoes. "Let us all with one consent pray to God that he would make manifest who among us is the best, that, sitting in the chair of Christ, he may piously rule his church." Now, that's very curious because if Jesus is depicted as a second Moses of sorts, as you don't want to say a replacement Moses, but as an additional Moses, a complementary Moses, it makes sense that if Moses had a chair, then, Jesus himself too would have a chair. So there's a chair of Christ. Elsewhere in the homilies, the writer goes on to say, "Therefore the multitude of the faithful ought to obey someone." Now remember, Jesus said to the multitude and to his disciples, right, to obey the scribes and Pharisees. And in Josephus, if we remember from the last episode, says that the multitude went after the Pharisees, and they trusted the Pharisees. They had confidence in the Pharisees' teaching. And presumably even, Jesus himself, when he was young, Jesus' parents, they too would have gone after the Pharisees. They would have believed the Pharisees. They knew that the Pharisees had their best interest in mind against the government, against the Sadducees, against the Romans, against everyone. Right? It was them against the world. Therefore, the multitude of the faithful ought to obey someone. This is kind of a subtle reference back to Matthew 23, verses 1 through 3. That they may live in harmony. For that which tends to the government of one person in the form of monarchy enables the subjects to enjoy peace by means of good order. Now, as I said, the chair of Christ is conceptually parallel to the seat of Moses, especially given that the Jewish followers of Jesus saw Jesus as the quote-unquote Moses of their generation. Again, another Jewish concept. Not only do passages like these define the chair as the metaphorical seat of power or dominion, but the latter also says that the multitudes of the faithful ought to obey someone. Who is Jesus speaking to in Matthew 23:1? It says Jesus spoke to the multitude and to his disciples. Do these not collectively qualify as the multitude of the faithful? Right? Jesus wasn't speaking to atheists. He wasn't speaking to Jews who went off and became Buddhists or something. These were just normal, faithful Jews. And then also specifically to his disciples, who again, they were also faithful Jews, of course, but they were specifically his disciples. As we discussed in the last video, these were outsiders and insiders. So it was a way for the author to say he was speaking to everyone, both the group and those outside the group. His followers had to obey the Pharisees, but also everybody had to. And when Peter says that the multitudes ought to obey someone, is this not comparable to Jesus saying that both the multitudes and the disciples ought to obey the scribes and Pharisees? It's much easier to see the unity between these passages than any supposed division, and in fact requires much more faith to do so than not do so. Now, I'd also like to move on to a discussion of our non-favorite person, but a fellow Jew nonetheless, Mr. Nehemiah Gordon, and his obsession with Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, and the obsession of many of his fans with this text. So there's an interesting admission in the work of Nehemiah Gordon, who claims to be a Karaite Jew. And what this means is that he's one who does not accept the, granted, biblical authority of the oral law or of the rabbis. He claims to live by quote-unquote scripture alone, much like Protestant Christians of late medieval Europe. However, he claims to have been raised as an Orthodox Misnagid, which is an anti-Hasidic Jew. And as some of us know, Jesus himself and his movement was Hasidic, at least in the ancient sense. Gordon's is a Hebrew scholar who has in recent years, as of the making of this video, come in friendly communication with Christian and Messianic leaders. Gordon has speaking engagements where he discusses his views about Jesus and Jesus' supposed disdain for the Pharisees, which Gordon himself also personally disdains. How convenient. Despite this, he writes a very honest admission in a footnote of one of his books, which, if you think that I don't read books of people that I dislike, you're incorrect in that regard. I have read this book, and I think it's a little silly, to say the least. However, as I said, in one of the footnotes early on in his book, he happens to say the following, and this is in his book, The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. New light on the seat of Moses from Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. So Nehemiah Gordon admits the following. He says, the metaphorical interpretation of Moses' seat as Mosaic authority seems likely. You know that his whole book is based on the premise that it's a physical chair? But he admits in one of his footnotes, see, guys, this is why it's so important to read the juicy content in all the footnotes. There's so much good information down there. He says in one of his footnotes that his own book probably doesn't have much of a basis, in that the opposing view, which that it's the rabbinic authority that Jesus is speaking of, seems likely. Those are his words. The metaphorical interpretation of Moses' seat as Mosaic authority seems likely. Let's make the screen a little bit bigger here. He goes on to say, it is a basic Pharisaic doctrine that the rabbis have the authority of Moses. This is expressed in the well-known Mishnaic account about the dispute between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Joshua. Now, here's the passage that Nehemiah Gordon is referring to. This is in Rosh Hashanah 2:9. It says, Rabbi Joshua then went to Rabbi Dosa ben Harkanas and said to him, if we come to inquire into the lawfulness of the decision of the court of Rabban Gamliel, we shall need to inquire into the decisions of every court which has arisen since the days of Moses until now. For it's written, then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, 70 the elders of Israel. Right? That's a biblical verse. And why are the names of the elders not expressly set forth, if not to teach that every 3 judges which have arisen up as a court over Israel are like to the court of Moses? In other words, the debate is about, hey, look, we can't start questioning and undermining, this particular case, that particular case, because everything is built on top of each other. And then eventually you have to get to the very foundation, which is Moses. And if you kick out that, the whole thing comes crumbling down. And so we have to remember that this is based on the authority that Moses had from God. Right? It's not made up. This is biblical authority from the written Torah itself that contained this idea that God gave Moses and the 70 elders, which was the first Sanhedrin in history, the authority to adjudicate cases. Right? As it's written, Moses sat to judge the people. This is in Exodus 18:3. So we find that sitting in the seat of Moses and deciding court cases are connected. And what is the court of Moses? Well, we'll explore that in our next section here. So now on to evidence from grammar. Lastly, there's an important grammatical argument to be made that the quote-unquote seat of Moses is not to be taken as a literal chair. Now, while it's well known among those who specifically study this topic, along with biblical archaeologists, that there were indeed sometimes a designated seat within a synagogue called the Moses seat or Moses' seat. At least this is what some archaeologists theorize. It's not a universally accepted idea, but there are those who say this. So, even if this is the case, let's now return to the exact words of Jesus himself. The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you to observe, that observe and do. Now, what's the subject of the sentence? The scribes and the Pharisees. Now, what's the main verb? They sit. Which noun is the main verb attached to? Moses' seat. As we can see, scribes and Pharisees is a plural phrase. There are multiple scribes and Pharisees, and we have multiple people within that combined group. Yet, there is grammatically one single chair, Moses' seat. It doesn't say seats. It doesn't say chairs, plural. There's only one seat. So shouldn't it have said they sit in Moses' seats? Or they sit in the seats of Moses? Well, we would imagine that this would be the case. However, if we want to interpret the synagogal chair as a literal seat, then we're left with a grammatically poorly formed statement by Jesus that sets up the listener and later readers to stumble over syntactical issues of plurality. Are we seriously to believe that all of the thousands of scribes and Pharisees piled on top of one another for the purpose of sitting on a single stone chair in some synagogue? What purpose would that serve? The absurdity of such a notion is not even worth entertaining. Rather, the idea that the seat of Moses is the title of an office or a seat of power, meaning a center of authority, makes much more grammatical and logical sense. If all of the scribes and Pharisees could not fit onto a single stone chair, then it could not have been a literal, singular chair. But could this not also be interpreted to mean individual scribes and Pharisees sit in the Moses seat of each of their respective synagogues, therefore do whatever they bid you observe? Sure it could. For example, the Chorazin synagogue has been known for 200 years with its black basalt ruins and its Moses seat, quote-unquote, where its distinguished teachers of the law sat. Right? However, what does physically sitting in a literal stone chair have to do with a person's obligation to obey the teachings of the one sitting? If a Roman general physically sat down in the Moses chair, would the masses be forced to obey him? If the pagan Roman Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman state religion, ordered the people of the synagogue to offer libations and sacrifices to the Roman gods, would the Jews of that synagogue be forced to obey him simply because he sat in the magic seat? Suppose in later times an Islamic imam sat in the seat. Would the Jewish masses be forced by Jesus' command to obey him and become Muslims? No, of course. Of course, merely sitting in the seat means nothing apart from the authority the sitter already possesses prior to taking his seat. The act of sitting has no impact on the authority of the sitter. People sit all the time. Nor does one sitting in the chair affect one's authority, since pagans and heretics could also seat themselves there. Yet we're commanded to not listen to them by the Torah. In fact, we're even told that an extraordinarily wicked figure, whom Christians call Antichrist, would install himself in the temple and proclaim himself to be God. If this Antichrist seated himself on the Ark of the Covenant, which is called the throne of God throughout the Tanakh, would anyone automatically be forced to obey him? Like, is it a Torah law that you have to obey the Antichrist? No. If the Antichrist sat on the seat of Moses, would you have to obey him? No. It all has to do with the authority that the person has, not that a rock has, not that the stone seat has. So then we find that there's something special about the person doing the sitting, not the mere act of sitting taking place on the seat. If all that mattered is that someone sat, then Roman and Muslim sitters would equally be qualified as teachers compared to the scribes and Pharisees, because again, it doesn't matter what they're teaching. All that matters is that they're doing the sitting, right? Yet notice that Jesus does not include the Sadducees, the Samaritans, the Greeks, or the Romans in his command to observe and do what they say, even if they sat in the chair. And this is because they did not have the authority to teach or judge, as was the responsibility of Moses when he sat. They were not the true heirs of the Mosaic duty. Rather, it was the scribes and Pharisees that were the true heirs of this obligation to teach the masses, or the multitudes, and judge cases. Now, if we know that mere sitting does not grant one authority, then the authority, as the Torah plainly implies, depends primarily on the ability. These are acquired through training, discipleship, and study. Right? Consider what Exodus 18, verses 25 through 26 have to say. And Moses chose able men, or capable men, out of all Israel, and made them heads over the people, and they judged the people at all times. Why did Moses make certain men judges over other men? They were able men, capable of judging righteously. Thus, it is the learned academic, the man of character, the pious scholar who occupies himself with the minutiae of Torah law that becomes the adopted descendant of Moses, becoming an heir to his seat, joining him in his dynasty, so to speak, and becoming worthy of occupying his jurisdiction. Because the scribes and Pharisees are the theological and intellectual and legal descendants, or descendants of his legal teachings of Moses, Jesus acknowledges their right to seat themselves down. This is the literal interpretation. They give themselves a seat. It's like when people say, hey, take a seat. They take themselves a seat in their father's seat, right? Again, metaphorical father, right? The father is like a teacher, and the student is compared to a son. And in this sense, they're like sons of Moses, just as people can be sons of Abraham, just as Paul referred to Timothy as his son, just as Elijah referred to Elisha as his son. All right, we'll wrap it up here, folks, and thank you again for joining in on the video today. I hope that this study has been enlightening, and if you enjoy where we're going so far, please make sure to leave a like and to comment below, and if you really think that we're a grand channel to watch here, then give us a subscribe as well. Hope you all are doing well, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Tzaddik, like, share, and subscribe. Come and join the ride. We're living online in the blink of an eye. Like, share, and subscribe. Come and join.